As the sun climbs to the zenith over the Sonoran Desert, summer temperatures routinely rise above 40 degrees Celsius. 48 degrees is a regular summertime temperature in Tucson. And the sparse vegetation provides little to no shade, and water is nowhere to be found. And even the cooler months are deadly ones for migrants who carry with them little more than hope. In the last 20 years, an estimated 8,000 people have lost their lives crossing just that one desert alone. Along with the Mediterranean, which has swallowed up over 1,000 migrants this past year, the Sonoran Desert is one of the world's deadliest places. And though the Mediterranean, the Sonoran, are one of the world's most deadly places, yet still the people come. They come, and they come by land to the United States. They come by sea to Europe. No externalizing or militarizing of the border seems to deter them, because what they are running away from is worse. Far worse. Gangs and cartels, violence, poverty, drought, despair. Children are arriving at the borders of our world with distended bellies and bulging eyes and hair loss. Signs of malnutrition caused by a homeland famine or exorbitant extortion rates that leave parents unable to purchase food. Political refugee or economic migrant? What does it matter? Can't we agree that it's a life that shouldn't be drowned in the ocean or turned to dust in the desert? Our reading for today says that we shall know love by this: Jesus laid down his life for us and calls us to do the same. If we have material possessions and if we see a neighbor in need and we refuse to help, we cannot say that God's love lives in us. The scriptures this day call us to be truthful about our privileged place in the world, to love, not just in speech, but in action. Last week, I traveled to the Mexican-U.S. borderlands with members of humanitarian aid groups from all over Europe and North America. And at the border, that some call hope and others name as despair, we saw humanity at its worst, but also at its absolute best. Lord, the beauty of love in action. In the visits with shelter residents, we heard consistent stories of cruelty perpetrated by Border Patrol and border guards. We saw the deadly lack of support for people on the move. We witnessed the desperation of families living in the Mexican streets across the border bridge from a country that shelters over 600 billionaires from the consequences of their greed. And like the nameless widow of Zarephath, gathering sticks for her family's last meal. God's children, our siblings, shut out by the wealthy nations, live every day at the edge of death. Thousands of years before single mothers crowded into the shelters of Tijuana, Juarez, Nogales, at the gates of Zarephath, in the wealthy kingdom of Israel, a poor widow testified. She testified, saying to the prophet Elijah, "As surely as the Lord God lives, I don't have enough food. Only a handful of flour in a jar, a bit of oil in a bottle. Look at me. Look at me, please. I'm collecting 2 sticks so that I can make food for myself and my son. We will eat this last bit of food and then we will die." Does no one in Zarephath see the widow and the child? Is there no one in Zarephath who will take them in? As our borderland delegation noted the similarities between oppressed people then and now, Mary Jo Letty said, walls are built in our hearts and minds long before they are ever built with steel and mortar and wire. Look at me. Look at me is the widow's ancient cry, and it bounces over the Mediterranean waves, and it crosses the Sonoran Desert on the wind, and it finds its voice in the bodies of neighbors much closer to home. If we sit still enough in these pews this morning, we will hear that cry coming from the homeless in Toronto, the poisoned in Grassy Narrows, the despairing in Nunavut, whose suicide rates are the highest in the world. And if "look at me" is the cry of the forgotten and the ignored, then I have heard my people cry, "Whom shall I send?" is the Lord and sea of sky and sea's response. Whom shall I send? Sit still enough, and you will hear Elijah calling to you, saying, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Go and do." For God promises that the jar will never be empty, the bottle will never run out. There is more than enough, and indeed, the only way to find your life is to give it away. I saw it over and over again at the border. Lord, the beauty and the power of love in action. Alvaro Enciso, an artist who goes every single Tuesday to place crosses in the desert where the bodies have been found. He is, as Mary Jo said, a guardian of memory, refusing to forget that someone died here, a husband, a father, a person, with nothing left but hope. I heard God speaking. I heard God speaking of endless life-saving love through the lives of the No More Deaths and Samaritan volunteers. People of faith who carry water jugs, first aid supplies, and food along the migrant routes. They do search and rescue missions. They provide basic first aid. They leave water for those who need it. And the U.S. government is trying to criminalize their work, threatening them with jail time for leaving water, providing shelter. But these faithful people, well, they have been sent by God, and they will not be deterred. You shall know love by this, that Jesus laid down his life for us and calls us to do the same. For God is well and truly alive in those who love, not just in speech, but in action. In Juarez, I met a pastor by the name of Juan Fierro. On his first Sunday at the El Bueno Pastor Methodist Church in Ciudad Juarez, there were just 2 people in the pews. A congregation of 2. Talk about flour running low and oil. 2 in an empty sanctuary. But undaunted, the pastor and his wife, Irma, and his congregation of 2 decided that they were going to open a meal program for children of Juarez. And then one day, someone heard about it and offered them a fridge, like the kind of fridge you or I might have bought in the 80s for our house. And Juan said, of course, thank you. And Juan's wife, Irma, turned to him and said, we already have a small fridge that we can barely fill with food. Why do we need a bigger fridge? And the pastor replied, if God has given us a bigger fridge, God will find a way to fill it. Donations of food soon followed. And one day, Irma turned to her husband in exasperation and said, what are we going to do with all of this food? It's going bad, and we have no one to give it to. And the pastor replied, if God has given us all of this food, there must be hungry people coming. And right around that time, the church discerned a new calling, a need for shelter beds. The building was old, the roof was leaking, but they found the means through the Methodist church channels, the government support that was in place, to put up 60 shelter beds, which filled almost immediately. And since the Trump administration enacted the inhumane Remain in Mexico policy 6 months ago, the streets of Juarez has flooded with 16,000 pushed back asylum seekers. There are only 2,000 shelter beds in that city. And seeing this most recent need, the pastor, his congregants, still only 2 of them, decided that they needed to do more, and so they pushed aside their pews and they lay bedding on the floor. And today they serve, feed, protect 130 to 150 people on the move. And standing on the site of what will soon be their nearly finished medical center, Pastor Juan turned to us who were gathered and he said, when you listen to the call of God and you follow God's call and mission for your church, God will provide and protect you. Do not be afraid. 107 years ago, a church was planted in this community. And when the church blew down in 1914, the Lord of Sea and Sky said, do not be afraid. Go, do. There is more than enough. And so we did. And when the church doors almost closed 100 years later, the Lord of Wind and Flame said, don't be afraid. Go and do. There is more than enough. And so we did. If God has given us this church with this congregation and its supportive community, then there must be more to go and do. Do not be afraid, my friends, my siblings, for there is more than enough. Amen.